Welcome to the Shipping Podcast, where I meet interesting maritime professionals sharing their passion for the shipping industry and their everyday job. I am your host. My name is Lena Göthberg. Hello, Shipping Podcast lovers. This is the 100th episode of the Shipping Podcast, and this will be a little bit different. It's all about me. I'm going to do a solo episode. This 100th episode will not be anyone else speaking than me. So I am the captain of this ship. My name is Lena Göthberg. I'm celebrating that milestone of having produced and released 100 episodes of the Shipping Podcast into cyberspace. Since I've been doing this for more than 3 years and sort of started a new career doing some groundbreaking work, I wanted to share with you what I have learned. I think that the shipping industry deserves a better profile than it has. I want more people to learn about the exciting industry that I work in. During the 25 years I've been a part of it, I have heard so many times that no one knows about us. We are the backbone of global trade and we contribute to globalization. We contribute to society, but we never get any attention. Well, that is our own fault, because we tend to speak to the people in the industry. And even though we are so passionate about our jobs and what we do, we forget to tell anyone outside of our industry how fabulous it is. When I started to think about this, I realized that the media hardly ever reports anything about our industry, unless when we are in the headlines because of a casualty of some kind or an oil spill. Occasionally, we are also in the headlines when the times are good and the ship owners get interviewed on how much money they earn owning the ships. But that was such a long time ago, so maybe people have forgotten. So how can we get more attention, become more visible? When I spoke with journalists, they kept telling me that they would not be interested in reporting in anything else but disasters. They said, Lena, we never report on a building that is not on fire. Why should we report on an industry that is just doing their job? Yeah. What about the media within the industry then? How are they reporting about us? Well, after having spent some time looking at that, I realized that all of them report on the same things. Things that are happening inside the industry, and their audience is the industry itself. Where would anyone who doesn't know anything about us find information that is easily accessible and presented in an easy way turn to? I also realized that the press in the maritime industry is rather expensive. And even if they claim that they have been digitized, they are not digitalized. They haven't changed their business model to adapt to the modern times. The media industry has transformed from the old printed newspaper into online media. The shipping industry has only seen one example of how the future of media is met, and that is Splash 24/7. So I spent some time speaking to Sam and Grant, testing if my view of the state which the shipping industry is in was accurate. And I can only say that they encouraged me to start the Shipping Podcast, and they have never become tired of me asking more and more questions. And for that, I'm very grateful. I started the Shipping Podcast after having studied and learned a lot about the online communication and social media in particular. When I was the Secretary General for the Institute of Shipping Analysis, I was given the task to rebrand and attract new members to the organization. But I was not given any marketing budget. At the same time, I was introduced through a mutual friend via a blind date on LinkedIn to a social media guru named Maria Gustafsson, who taught me everything there was to know about social media and strategy and how to reach as many people as possible. I started to attend conferences for people who love online marketing, including programmers and all kinds of specialists in this new area of expertise that I'd never come in contact with before. I met a podcasting geek by the name of Martin Lindeskog who passionately spoke about podcasting. Podcasting is all about storytelling, and so is shipping. After me saying for more than a year that someone should start a podcast in our industry, I was told, are you going to do this or are you going to continue just to talk about it? Okay, I love a challenge. And I really had a hard time saying to them, well, maybe someone else should do it. So instead, I started investigating how to attack this. What gear would I need? And how does it all work behind the scenes? After a while, I found the Podcasting School for Women with Jessica Kupferman and Elsie Escobar. At that point, I had no idea what those two ladies would come to mean to me, and I certainly didn't know what superstars they are in the podcasting space. Anyway, it was an online course, so every Monday evening through the summer 2015, I attended their webinar class. Do I have to say that I was one of two women outside the USA? The other lady was from Canada. Now I need to share a secret. I did actually my first podcast interview with borrowed equipment. And that was on board the Maersk McKinney Møller when she called Port of Gothenburg on her maiden voyage. The reason behind that was that I saw the tweet that Captain Niels Pedersen shared when he passed by the Singapore Straits en route to Europe. And I replied to that tweet, asked if I could come on board when he reached my hometown and the end of his journey. And I got a positive answer. So I had an open invitation from the world's largest container vessel at the time. I had a crazy idea to start a podcast, and I had a friend who knew how to record. How to grab this opportunity and turn it into something great. I invited my friend Maria to join me on board the ship. She had never been on a container ship before, which not a lot of people have actually been, and especially not the largest one in the world, so she accepted. And we went to the port together, with her equipment and with my invitation to meet the captain of the ship. Unfortunately, there was a strike going on in the port that day, which is not that uncommon, so the shipping company couldn't help us to get to the ship. It really started to look like the opportunity would be lost. But no, a promise is a promise, and Captain Niels organized a car to pick us up and take us to that gigantic ship. Niels was the nicest host ever and showed us around, offered us coffee, and was definitely game for doing a podcast interview. He told us that he was used to 400 journalists visiting the ship when calling in Asia, and that he had had all the large broadcasting companies on board. Oh my God, I didn't dare to tell him that I was the rookie here. I had never interviewed anyone before. And if it hadn't been for Maria, I'm sure our conversation would never have been captured on tape at all. I have so many to thank for the success I have achieved so far. I cannot mention them all. When I started out, I had a lot of supporters, also sponsoring me with advertising in the podcast. I am not sure they even knew what they were getting themselves into, but it was such a nice way of seeing appreciation of me and my vision, and it really moved me. Thank you. Also, I got a lot of support from people who trusted me to interview them. I had got the advice to release more than one episode to start with, to attract the interest from more people, just in case they didn't like the one that I did release. I started out with Jonathan Wichmann, who had just left Maersk as head of social, and whom I got to know when I was in my previous position as Secretary General for the Institute of Shipping Analysis. During the time when I had the responsibility to rebrand the Institute of Shipping Analysis, which was an organization for business intelligence on a global arena, I didn't get any marketing budget. That was a little bit frustrating, until I realized that I could study social media and how that is done, and that wouldn't cost anything more than the time I put in. At this moment of time, they were talking about Facebook on the news in Sweden. So I understood that this was something I had to dive into a little bit deeper. I started to hang out on events and gatherings where people that love online communication gathered. That's how I met Maria, who I mentioned before. Maria was the engine behind something called WebCoast, which was an unconference, a meeting where the participants share their knowledge in a completely different way than usual conferences. It was called WebCoast, and I was fortunate enough to participate twice. So I learned a lot about social media and the mechanics behind how to use it, where to use it, and how to put together a strategy. I learned from people who love online communication, and they all spoke about Maersk and their journey in social media. No, that is how I contacted Jonathan, and he was a good sport and just accepted my invitation to be a guest on my newly started shipping podcast. The same thing happened with Johan Hagman, head of shipping and ferries at Stena AB, who invited me and my gear to his office and gave me material to a very interesting episode. Johan has since supported me in many ways, and I am happy to count him as one of my friends. But what about the women? I started to scrutinize myself and think about which people I invited to the podcast and how I made the same choices as the rest of the industry. I only invited men. I think that's when I put my foot down on my own behavior and decided to set a goal of 50% female guests. Who, if not me, should change the fact that we hardly hear or see any women in the shipping industry? I am a long-lasting member of VISTA, that is Women's International Shipping and Trading Association, and I know so many competent and interesting women in this industry, so I really can shed some light on them. That's when I thought about Thina Saltvedt, one of the coolest women I know. She's a macro analyst at Nordea in Oslo, and she had been speaking at the executive meeting which I organized yearly when I was at the Institute of Shipping Analysis. Since I had listened to Thina, I knew I couldn't keep her from the world. I just had to get her as one of my first guests. After having interviewed these 4 excellent people, struggled with editing the recordings and learned all the ins and outs of how to get these recordings out into the open, I had thought about how this new feature would be greeted by the audience. I knew that many of the people in the maritime industry had no idea how to find a podcast and certainly not how to listen to it. I thought a little bit about that, and I knew I had to set up a website, and it had to be very clear and easy to manage. So after a little bit of research, I found a WordPress theme specially designed to cater for audio and podcast, and went for that. Easy instructions on how to download a podcast if you wanted to listen via the mobile, and just a very big play button if you just wanted to sit in front of your screen and listen. This sounds like ancient times, but I have only been doing this for 3.5 years. I work in the shipping industry. In 2015, the maritime industry wasn't mature enough for a shipping podcast. That's why I walked that extra mile of not giving people an excuse not to listen to my episodes. I cannot count all the mobile phones I have held in my hands since I started this journey. Many are the elderly men that has asked me how to listen on their mobile. That has really tested my patience, something I do not have very much of, but it has given me plenty of opportunities to speak about my passion with them, eye to eye, since they have always approached me when they didn't think anyone else was listening. So why did I take on the task of starting a podcast in the maritime industry? The easy answer is because I can. I learned how to do this, something that no one else in my industry has done, or no one else even thought about doing. I would like to take this opportunity to answer a few questions that keeps popping up. And if you have more questions, you are more than welcome to send them to hello@shippingpodcast.com, and perhaps I can answer them in episodes to come. If this turns out well, I might even do more solo episodes. Question number 1. Who are your listeners? Let me start by saying that statistics for podcasts are not as easy to get as, for instance, for websites via Google Analytics. However, I know that the Shipping Podcast has been downloaded almost 170,000 times since I started, in 165 countries. The top 10 countries where the Shipping Podcast is downloaded are 1. USA, 2. Sweden, 3. United Kingdom, 4. Norway, 5. Denmark, 6. Germany, 7. the Netherlands, 8. Canada, 9. Australia, and 10. Finland. I can narrow it down to see that, for example, in the USA, the podcast is downloaded in New York, San Francisco, and Washington. I can spot Houston, Seattle, and Los Angeles on the map too. I leave it to you to figure out why the podcast is popular in these particular places. The top 10 list changes from time to time. So these are the countries that are on the top list right now, but it changes. I can see both China and India coming along strongly, and soon it will not only be a Scandinavian podcast audience that I've got. I get so many emails, messages through social channels and on LinkedIn from young people. They have either just started their career or are still students, and they thank me for giving them a perspective on their work. Through my podcast, they can see the career paths available to them. They also suggest people they want to listen to and ask me questions or even pitch new business ideas to me. It's at those occasions I feel insufficient and I wish I could do more for them. I also get feedback from grown-ups, for instance from teachers at maritime universities, who tells me that they recommend their students to listen to my podcast when they start questioning why they should study to become master mariners or chief engineers when the entire industry is discussing autonomous ships. I think that is a little bit for us to think about. The podcast medium, I should say, is a channel where the audience becomes very loyal. I appreciate the loyal tribe of listeners that I have built. I feel the pressure to continue delivering a new episode every other Friday, since that is what they have grown to expect from me. I have even named every other Friday Shipping Podcast Friday, so that everyone knows what week it is. To podcast is serious business for me. I have always been a keen radio listener. I'm also suffering from travel sickness, so I have a very hard time reading on trains or in cars. But listening, that's okay. And it keeps my mind busy, not to think about the transportation and the movements. When I discovered how easy it was to set up my own so-called radio channel, but as a podcast, and deliver it through apps on the mobile to people, I decided that I wanted to learn how to do that. This means that I have learned a lot about the audio industry, which of course is something completely different to the maritime industry, but maybe in one sense. There are hardly any women. But as I said before, I have found the most outstanding, professional, and award-winning women in this industry as well. Since podcasting is becoming mainstream media, more and more people, also in the shipping industry, is discovering that there is a new outlet for and about the maritime industry. I now see and welcome a few more podcasts to the shipping industry, a few of them produced by larger companies and organizations, and a few initiatives from people like me, or younger. I think it's great, and I think we should work together to try and raise the profile of shipping. But I'm not sure that that view is shared. At least that is not my impression when it comes to the podcasts released by some of the companies in the maritime domain. On that note, I would like to say that I would love to work on a network for the podcasts produced in this industry, and I have a few ideas on how we could work together to reach further. But that will have to wait until I have managed to bring in a few companies who want to support a network like that. The next question, or usually the first one, is, do you earn any money on this? The short answer is no, not yet. But that was not the intention. The intention was to change the perception of the maritime industry. I realize now that I did not live up to that intention, since most of my listeners are people who work in the industry. Maritime people are my main audience. They listen to what other people in the maritime industry, my interviewees, are working on. When I started, there were so many who wanted to support me, and I'm grateful to them. They knew that when I engage in something, I deliver. That is my trademark and has always been. Many companies bought what I sold. Rather quickly, I realized that this took too long. I didn't have the time to sell ads per episode. I needed to look at the larger picture. I need a platform consisting of companies that is sharing my vision. And to collaborate with a podcast is more building your brand than buying commercial ads in one episode. You need to look upon this long term and build your brand around it. And that is what the Swedish club did when they supported me for a couple of episodes. To try and build this larger platform, I started analyzing who are the big 5 companies advertising on the 5 big maritime trade shows. And I realized that that is the classification societies. However, the way that those companies are exposing themselves did not really go together with what I wanted to achieve. So I had to go back and put on my thinking cap. Ship owners were out of the question since they have not recovered from the downturn yet. So I started to think, who is interested in the maritime cluster and have not yet set their mark there? I concluded that it must be the companies delivering connectivity, now targeting the virgin territory of the shipping industry. So I picked up the phone and reached out to the closest company working in this domain of connectivity. And the person who answered started by saying, "Oh, Lena, I love your podcast. I would love to have that on our new website." And my God, I almost fell off my chair when that happened. So we negotiated terms and what I was expected to deliver in exchange. And I started to see some light in the tunnel. Well, 3 months later, this company took a dip. Their CEO was kicked out. Costs were cut. So no new website. And their maritime unit disappeared. This made me a little bit disappointed, to say the least. But it also confirmed my idea of how to develop the shipping podcast and how it must become something more than it is today. The currency for a podcast is downloads and subscriptions. That is the way algorithm works in this industry. That's how a podcast can gain momentum and raise to the top lists and maybe get even more listeners, and so on and so on. I am grateful for every person who takes an interest in my project, but I would really like more listeners. Just think about the success of a podcast about shipping, climbing the list of most listened to podcasts, and maybe reach even more people with a message that this is the most interesting industry to work with. I have between 5,500 and 6,000 downloads a month. This is so many more than I could ever have expected when I started this podcast. It means that I'm starting to make waves, and that is so much fun. That is probably also why some of the companies who have started podcasts of their own want me to promote their podcasts in the shipping podcast. I have taken the time to build this tribe that is listening to me, and I'm very protective about them. My listeners are very valuable to me in more ways than one. But then having to tell large companies that in order for them to be promoted, they have to pay as every other advertiser, and then receiving the answer that they did not intend to pay, or some of them wanted to pay but very little. That was really a disappointment to me, and I'm happy that I decided not to go along with it. But it only goes to show that I have to try harder to explain to this industry what I want to achieve. Moving from the sponsors that I had when I started to companies that want their brand to be associated with change, I wanted to understand how companies in our industry spend their marketing budgets and maybe try and change that a little bit as well, to maybe also spend a little bit of money advertising in podcasts. So I started analyzing the large companies supplying the maritime industry in various ways. Their marketing budgets are big. So reallocating some of the money shouldn't be that hard, I thought. Well, what I found is that if it's a global company, the ones that wouldn't miss a couple of thousands of euros or dollars if spent on something different, they work with media buyers. I had never before come across this occupation, so I started to look into what kind of animal is this? And I realized that this is a sort of a broker who buys advertising space on behalf of their clients. And when I approached one of them, I realized that me asking them to change their view of where their clients should have their products or services showcased, it was not easy, especially if they were not podcast listeners. By now, I hope you understand how much of a disruptor in the maritime industry that I am. It's one thing to start something new and obtain a lot of eager and enthusiastic listeners, but it's a completely different ballgame to change how and where companies market themselves. It's an entire system that needs to change and be disrupted. So back to square one. Anyone who wants to support me financially until I have found the people who want to work with me to achieve change and share my vision, I have opened a Patreon account on www.patreon.com/shippingpodcast. Patreon is a membership platform that provides business tools for creators to run a subscription content service And it's the best way for artists and creators to get sustainable income. The rest of you have the task to get more people to subscribe. The last question I'm going to answer is, how do you find your guests? Well, I started with people that I know, people who live nearby, and people that I found interesting to listen to. Until I got the feedback, why do you do this in English? You only interview local people. Well, there is more than one answer to that, the apparent one being that I would not have achieved downloads in 165 countries if I had made this podcast in Swedish, even though it might have been easier for me in so many other ways. Before I started, I realized that the people I wanted to interview were maybe not the most tech-savvy, so I had to make it easy for them. That meant that I had to bring my equipment to them and just make them feel comfortable, open up, and no stress at all. Little did they know how my heart was pounding and I was so stressed out. But I bought myself a small recorder called Zoom H2N and 2 clip-on microphones and started to look for interesting people with interesting things to say also outside where I live. Now I need to thank my network. I owe so much to so many people who have helped me open doors to people who didn't know who I was, let alone didn't know what a podcast was. I will not mention names. You know who you are. I attend a lot of conferences, and when doing so, I targeted people and asked them if they would become a guest on my podcast, and some of them wanted that. After a while, I realized that maybe they were more interested in networking and mingling at the event to which they had taken the effort to go to than talking to me. And maybe I didn't get the time I wanted with them, so I changed my tactics. Now I go to one city at a time and I interview the ones on my target list who are in the office when I have the time to go there. You probably realize that the problem with this way of doing interviews is that it is expensive for me to travel. That's why I haven't got too many interviews outside Europe, even though people are nagging at me to go to the Far East and make interviews because there are so many interesting things happening out there. Another obstacle is that I only get to interview the people who are not traveling when I'm in their town. I cannot use my target list of people that I want to interview in the way I want to. After having done this for 3 years, I have now upgraded my equipment. I have moved on from clip-ons to real microphones on the desk in front of you. And I can also have up to 6 people in a conversation. I am thinking of developing the concept. Since I've also found some younger people that I want to interview, I'm looking into using tools to interview online. I think it will be a mix of me meeting people in person and doing online interviews moving forward. How do you reach your guests? Some people I don't reach. Very important people have staff to protect them against journalists and people like me. So there I will have to try different ways how to reach them. But so far, I have only had 2 people decline participation. One is out of my reach. I will try to find a different way to get him to understand that it is in the shipping podcast where you are able to speak up and make your voice heard so that he will become a guest on my podcast. The other one who is declining, he's only teasing me. I know him. He's now withdrawn from my list of people I want to interview. I am happy to report that out of the 100 episodes, 44 are interviews with women. Which other media channel in our industry have showcased so many women? I know many fabulous women with interesting jobs. So I promise you, I will continue to deliver interviews with female voices from the maritime industry. As a matter of fact, I need to up my game, as my goal is to have 50-50. Something that more media outlets in our industry needs to think about. And the companies advertising in these channels. How does your money spent on marketing support your diversity agenda, if you have one? If you have listened to a few of the episodes of the Shipping Podcast, you realize that I put the same questions to all my guests. And then I listen. Depending on the answer they give, the conversations take off in different directions. But the questions I set out to find the answers to have been the same for 3.5 years now. I want the interviewees to tell me how she or he entered the maritime industry, so that you would hear how few that found us on purpose. Most of the people in our industry ends up here because they stepped on that famous banana leaf. Isn't it time that we do something about that and start to attract people to find us instead of them having to stumble into our bubble? The next question is, how do you see the future for shipping in general? That is an important question to understand where the mindset of the guest is. How far have they traveled on the journey of change? And where are they in this industry revolution 4.0? And my favorite question, how will the shipping industry become more visible to the general public? Lately, I have got more viable answers, but I have been amazed to sit with people who has the power to raise the profile of our industry. And some even have the budget to do it, and they look like a question mark when I say, how can we get the maritime industry more visible? And the answer they give, I have no idea. I want to shake them. If they don't know when someone who is coming to them with a new tool, a new way to broadcast about the shipping industry, and they still cannot connect the dots, then I think we need to test something new. I will leave you now. I have done my first solo episode. I think it's long enough. I feel exhausted, but also curious on how my listeners will receive this short version of my journey with the Shipping Podcast. I have only told you parts of what I have experienced. If you want more of this, you need to tell me. If you want to work with me, you need to tell me. If you are shy, you can email me at hello@shippingpodcast.com. But if you really want to make a difference and support me and the Shipping Podcast, you do it publicly. I love feedback. That is all I can say. So, until the next time, from me to you, over and out. Thank you for listening to the Shipping Podcast. Don't forget to tell everyone that you meet that there is a Shipping Podcast available and that they should download it and listen to the maritime professionals who are sharing their passion for the shipping industry.